Thank you, Mr Davies. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship, and I beg to move that this House has considered regulation of the private rented sector. I'm grateful to have secured time for a debate on this matter, which continues to directly affect all of our constituents. Indeed, I'd start by paying tribute to my constituents in Liverpool Walton, who continue to be the innocent victims of the UK's broken housing system. And I also want to start by commending stakeholders in this area, from Merseyside and Vauxhall Law Centre, as well as Acorn Merseyside at a local level, to the excellent Renters Reform Coalition at a national level. The private rented sector continues to be dominated by insecure tenure, increasingly unaffordable rents, poor housing quality, and the ever-present threat of homelessness. No one in this House should underestimate the dislocating and exhausting experience of being removed from the place they call home. I'm unsure if anyone in this House has received a Section 21 notice. I'm unsure if anyone in this House has felt unable to complain about the problems of damp, mould or other poor conditions for fear of a retaliatory eviction. And I'm unsure if anyone in this House has had to endure the stress of having only 2 months to find a new property in what is already a chaotic and punishing market. And I'm not sure if anyone in this House has had only 2 months to search for a new school for their children, for a new doctor's or dentist surgery, and some of the basic services we take for granted following the receipt of a Section 21 notice. What I am sure of is that the government was absolutely right to introduce a ban on Section 21 evictions, along with other measures in the Renters Reform Bill, to correct the power imbalance that currently exists between landlords and tenants. But we must not forget what the cost of delay and inaction has been. And to illustrate this, I want to discuss one of my constituents. My constituent received a Section 21 notice through the post, giving her 2 months to vacate her property. The landlord gave 2 reasons for eviction. He was looking at increasing rental income and was also looking to sell the property. My constituent has 2 children, a daughter aged 7 and a son aged 4. Her son has a severe learning disability and is non-verbal. And despite this, come the start of June, her and her family will become homeless. I'd like to invite the Minister to hear directly from my constituents on the impact of this eviction on her and her family's mental and physical health. And I would be happy for my office to make contact with her office to facilitate this. The measures in the Renters Reform Bill will come too late for this constituent, but we can now work to ensure that no constituent faces the same crushing uncertainty again. Thankfully, after a 4-year delay following the announcement of the Renters Reform Bill, the government has finally found time to introduce this important piece of legislation. I stand ready and willing to work together with colleagues across the House to ensure that this bill makes the private rented sector as fair as possible and that local authorities are given the resources to enable them to regulate the sector effectively for the benefit of all our constituents. I'll be happy to give way.
I'm grateful to him for giving way and congratulate him on getting this really important debate. He's making a very powerful case. Brighton, my constituency, is one of the most expensive places to rent outside of London, and my constituents are being ripped off on a daily basis. On the issue of the Renters Reform Bill, which is certainly very welcome and very late, does he agree that there is actually a big gap in it when it comes to precisely more enforcement powers for local authorities so they can target rogue landlords, and also on the issue of the outrageous discrimination which still allows basically blanket bans on people renting if, for example, they've got children or if they rely on benefits. Those absolutely have to be loopholes that are closed right now, and it's not good enough for the Minister to be able to say we're going to do it sometime in the future.
Dan Carden.
Thank you, Mr Davies. I'm grateful for my colleague's intervention. I'm going to touch on both of those points in some detail, and I hope the Minister will be able to respond and that we can work together to see the bill strengthened over time. So I'll use the rest of my time that I have today to cover some of the actions that I think can be taken to ensure that these reforms are robust enough to provide renters with real security in their homes. And I aim to do this in the spirit of genuine cooperation. There is considerable appetite across the House to make this piece of legislation as effective as possible. To do this, I want to cover three primary areas where policy can be improved within the bill itself, on action related to enforcement and addressing the current crisis around affordability. As previously outlined, the abolition of Section 21 evictions is a much welcome step, but the government must go further to guarantee private housing providers do not use other routes to subject renters to unfair eviction. Landlords can continue to reclaim possession of their properties in the case of a sale, or if they or a family member wishes to move into the property. However, as the bill currently stands, following an eviction on these grounds, landlords can re-let their properties after a period of 3 months. This length of time is too short and will not act as a proper deterrent to landlords who seek to exploit the abolition of Section 21. So the government must extend this no reletting period to a minimum of 12 months. If they don't, renters will not feel the assurance and safety intended to be at the heart of these reforms. Further, would the Minister explain what recourse tenants would have if they are evicted unlawfully under these grounds? Can tenants apply for a rent repayment order, for example? And if not, what other forms of compensation are available? The current proposed 2-month notice period and 6-month initial protected period leaves those evicted under legitimate no-fault grounds in the same position as they currently are under Section 21. This notice period should be extended to an absolute minimum of 4 months. And this isn't new to government. In the midst of the COVID pandemic, Section 21 notice was extended to 4 months. And I can tell the Minister, the situation in the housing market has deteriorated, not improved since then, and it is only logical for the government to look at this and seriously consider extending this period again. And the benefits are obvious. If tenants are given more time to find somewhere to live, this will spare the taxpayer and the tenant from a devastating cost of homelessness, both financially and mentally. Organisations, including Shelter, have expressed concern at the amendments the Renters Reform Bill makes to homelessness legislation. Private renters who receive a possession notice will no longer have the right to immediate help from the council to avoid homelessness. This is because the law no longer specifies when help to prevent homelessness should be available to private renters. Instead, it leaves this to the discretion of local authorities. This is despite the government knowing that early intervention is paramount to protecting tenants and preventing homelessness. So will the government urgently move to address this weakness of the bill, which directly undermines both the Homelessness Reduction Act and rough sleeping strategy? We should be moving to boost and improve protections related to homelessness prevention, not to weaken them. I now want to speak about enforcement. The property portal and ombudsman are positive elements of the bill, but they will only help to drive up standards if the government arms local authorities with the means to properly investigate and enforce. Currently, a postcode lottery exists within the sector. Enforcement action depends on how diligent and well-resourced local authorities are. In my local authority area of Liverpool, we have a selective licensing scheme that aims to proactively regulate the privately rented sector. Despite the government shrinking the area that the licensing scheme applied to in 2020, the team at Liverpool City Council have reported that out of 2,308 inspections, 917 disrepair matters have been identified, as well as 1,053 breaches of licensing conditions. And this is despite the NRLA previously describing the scheme as a waste of time. The local authority looks to work in cooperation with licence holders where possible, but unfortunately some enforcement action is always going to be inevitable. The Council describes the amount of referrals to the service as substantial, and that they say that resourcing and recruitment remains a challenge. So I wonder if the Minister will commit to ring-fencing resources to ensure new regulations can be properly enforced through the Property Portal and Ombudsman. I'd like to turn to affordability now. There is an absolute crisis of affordability within the private rented sector, and yet calls continue to be ignored by government. Research from Rightmove has shown that in the past year alone, rents have risen at their fastest rate in 16 years, increasing by an average of 11% across Great Britain. And yet I have never heard anyone on the government benches express concern that rent increases contribute to inflation, when that argument is levied often when it comes to pay restraint or welfare payments. Why is it never said to landlords to heed the same advice? These price increases represent an emergency, and the government is moving too slowly to combat these rises. There have been 5 housing ministers in the last year, and it seems private renters are the losers from years of indifference and delay by government. Housing generally already forms the biggest expense for renters. According to Crisis, private tenants on the lowest 10% of incomes are facing combined rents, food and utility costs that exceed their total incomes by 43%. The impact of further rent increases will be deep. According to government figures, between January and March 2023, the number of Section 21 claims increased by a huge 52%, and there was a 16% rise in non-Section 21 evictions, the highest since data began in 2009. The Rent Tribunal still continues to allow rents to go higher than the landlord may initially request, which provides a major disincentive to use tribunals. So will the Minister work with me to increase constituents' means to challenge rent increases and improve the utility of the Rent Tribunal? If action is not taken to combat rent increases, then landlords will simply evict tenants through pricing them out of staying in the property. Happy to give way.
Him to give way again, and he's making a really powerful case. Would he agree that we actually also need to be looking at rent controls, which are used in many other countries without a problem? We simply can't have a situation where rents are allowed to spiral out of all control. People are never going to be able to earn enough to have a mortgage. They can't even earn enough now to pay their own bills. So we need to have something that is far stronger, even than what he's describing, I think.
Anne Carden.
Absolutely, I would back her calls for the government to look at rent controls and the best international comparisons, because this is not just an issue for our constituents. As I've said, it's an issue for the economy and inflation, and in the end it hurts all of us. The Minister could also move to increase local housing allowance. LHA rates have been frozen since 2019. Following the huge increase in inflation and house prices, this freezing means that private tenants face an ever-increasing gap between housing benefit and their actual rent. So I wonder what discussions are taking place within government to modify this. Inaction is prolonging and deepening homelessness. Further, there are white paper commitments missing from the version of the bill recently published. Where are the measures to outlaw blanket bans on renting to those in receipt of housing benefit? The government has recognised this discrimination is wrong. However, measures to address this are missing from the bill. I would appreciate some guidance from the Minister on this point in her response. And I want to conclude today by discussing an important amendment I intend to put down to the Renters Reform Bill. Awab Ishak was a 2-year-old boy killed by mould in a social housing flat. Unfortunately, Awab's story echoes much of the casework that comes through my office, and I'm sure through the offices of many members across the House. This followed Awab's social landlord repeatedly failing to fix the mould problem in his family's flat, blaming these problems on his family's lifestyle. In response, the Secretary of State moved quickly to put down amendments to the Social Housing Regulation Bill to impose timeframes on landlords to investigate hazards and make repairs. That was absolutely the right move, and the government must now put the same protections in place for private renters. As the Citizens' Advice report, Damp, Cold and Full of Mould has shown, 2.7 million renting households, including 1.6 million children in this country, are living in damp, cold or mouldy homes. These conditions have a disastrous effect on people's physical and mental health.
Thanks, Abena. I want to say thank you for my honourable friend for putting forward this important debate. I have a huge amount of housing cases where a lot of my constituents are living in damp and mould properties, and I've had responses from housing associations that are saying it's down to their lifestyle, which is factually incorrect. And also constituents are facing soaring rents. I want to see a proper ombudsman in place for constituents that are living in private rented accommodation. And will the honourable friend agree with me that the private rented charter will make things a lot fairer for individuals up and down the country?
I'm grateful to my honourable friend for that intervention. I do agree with her, and I hope this bill is an opportunity for us to ensure the government can put more protections in for our constituents. The conditions that people live in have a disastrous effect on their physical and mental health, but tenants are left with little choice than to stay in homes that make them ill and even kill them. So will the Minister meet with me to discuss how we can bring the private sector in line with the social sector in ensuring that landlords deal with serious hazards in privately rented homes in a timely manner? As we have sadly witnessed, the cost of failing to do so can be fatal. And I will leave the Minister with that and look forward to working with her and colleagues on this hugely important area of policy. Thank you.
The question is,